a volunteer counsellor with the charity Childline was dismissed after raising concerns about the way some young people are rushed into changing gender. Former barrister James Esses said that he was concerned many youngsters were confused about gender identity and were wrongly automatically categorised as transgender or fast-tracked into making life-altering decisions such as surgery. He also was told to leave a 5-year degree course at a college in West London. So he's been through the ringer based around his views on biological sex. And James Esses joins me now. Hi, James.
Hi, Mark.
So, James, what is your view, which has become so controversial, in relation to children and young people wanting to transition to another gender?
I'm not really sure, Mark. That still baffles me as a question, because all I've ever sought for is for open explorative therapy for vulnerable children with a serious mental health condition to be available to them. That's what I saw in the government petition that I put forward a few months ago, which got a government response, quite a favourable response, a couple of weeks back. I'm not quite sure what the controversy is exactly.
What is your view about young people seeking another gender?
I think we need to come back to basics, which is that in order to transition in this country, one must be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is a mental health condition. And I think that has to be the starting point. And as we do with all mental health conditions, the starting point should be with talking therapy in order to try and alleviate those symptoms, but also to try and explore contributing factors, underlying causes, and actually open up the conversation a bit. But what I'm finding more and more is that children are being quasi-encouraged down a potentially irreversible path of medication and one day even leading on to surgery.
What are the rules around children being medicated by way of transition or indeed having operations? What are the rules?
Well, so much of this has changed recently. I mean, obviously, we've seen the Kira Bell ruling, which is undergoing an appeal at the moment in relation to puberty blockers for under 16s. So the legal lay of the land is changing a bit. But up until recently, young people, including under the age of 16, could avail of this type of medication. Via the NHS. We're also seeing more and more private clinics starting up who are offering this type of medication as well. So we see kind of a starting point of puberty blockers, which we're regularly told are reversible, but actually all of the studies show that the vast majority of those that take puberty blockers will go on to take cross-sex hormones. So it seems to be a bit of a slippery slope. But outside of the medical sphere, one of my biggest concerns is even around social transitioning. Because what I find more and more is that young people, by charities, even at school, are being encouraged to change their pronouns, change their dress, start to identify themselves off the bat as the other sex. And actually, once you've committed to that, I think for young people in particular, it's quite difficult to backtrack from that later down the line.
And what are puberty blockers? How do they work?
Well, I mean, they do what they say on the tin, really. They stop the hormone changes that your body would go through. The thought behind it is that, and this is what a lot of trans activists will say, they say that it gives a young person time to basically decide whether or not they actually want to change fully to the other sex. Because if they go through puberty, develop all of the changes that the body would develop as part of going through the biological puberty, it will be much more difficult in the longer term. Now, at first glance, that makes sense. But then when we come to the point of thinking, well, what are we actually doing here? We're artificially halting someone's biological, natural process. And again, puberty is a very stressful and confusing time for young people. It's so many changes, hormonal, neuropsychological. But actually, what we find again in research is that it's actually going through the puberty that helps a young person to eventually become comfortable with who they are. But if we treat it as something to be afraid of from the outset, I struggle to see how young people can become comfortable in their own skin.
However, in your earlier answer, you talked about the fact that a child might speak to a counsellor and that you've got a talking therapy where you can sort of deal with the symptoms or dilute those instincts. But that would imply that wanting to be a different gender is a bad thing or even an illness. Many trans activists would say that it's a blessing and it should be embraced.
Well, I think we need to make a distinction between sex and gender. I also question where we've got to in terms of this idea of being gender atypical. I mean, there's nothing wrong, and we should be encouraging this. There's nothing wrong with being a feminine boy or a masculine girl. We all possess a variety of traits, both masculine and feminine. But a lot of activists seem to suggest that there are these kind of two poles where you've got these really 100% masculine men and these really 100% feminine women. And it's not. It's a fallacy. We all have a bit of everything in us. So people can express themselves and live their lives and present themselves as they want. But I think going around changing biology, particularly when children are concerned, is deeply unwise.
However, this idea of talking therapies, it might be considered by some to be the equivalent of gay conversion therapy, where you have a child that feels that they are in the wrong body. And what you're pushing for is essentially a conversation in which to change their mind for them, to talk them out of it.
Not at all. I think one of the key tenets of psychotherapy is that you should never go into a conversation with a predetermined outcome. And that applies both ways. So in the same way that it's not my job to change somebody's mind, we also shouldn't be going into a conversation assuming that we should affirm them towards transitioning. I think the term conversion therapy is being thrown about, but it's a bit of a misnomer, actually, because it gives the impression that there are trained therapists up and down the country engaging in some historically abhorrent practices, and it's just not the case. I've read studies, including ones produced by Stonewall, and those type of conversion practices typically take place in faith-based or in family settings. So I think it's a bit misleading to suggest that therapists are carrying out these practices.
What do you think should happen if, let's say, a 12-year-old goes to a counsellor and expresses a desire to be a different gender? What do you think should happen? Should they have access to any medication at all?
I'm not going to give a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, which I think is part of the problem of where we're at currently. I think we need to take each case as it comes. And I'm not going to rule out that type of medication because for some people it will be appropriate. But that shouldn't be the starting point. You know, when I've engaged with young people in the past who've presented with gender dysphoria, the first thing is treating them with respect and dignity and showing them that you're hearing just how difficult things are for them. But then gently over time, as you build that rapport, it's about opening up the conversation. It's about exploring what else is going on in that young person's life that could be contributing to this. I mean, recent research has shown a significant link between gender dysphoria and other issues such as bullying, previous traumatic experiences, even autism spectrum disorder. So we're doing our duty by exploring things holistically.
And also, isn't the answer, the fix for all of this, to say to any child, do whatever you like once you're an adult? Because the danger is that any medical interventions under the age of 16, as you say, will probably have a lasting impact. And if they regret the transition, then they've really got a problem.
Well, this is it exactly. Particularly when we're talking about very young children. I think in the past I've dealt with children as young as 9 or 10 presenting with gender dysphoria, and as I kind of gently tried to explore even what their understanding of the words sex and gender were, they couldn't tell me. And it's because they were far too young, actually, to truly comprehend it. And they were still a while off puberty. And yet they were telling me that they wanted it to be completely halted. So, yes, I would agree with you. And I think that, once you're an adult, people should be able to do what they want. But we have a duty of care to protect children. Are
you transphobic? Do you think that anybody wanting to transition has something wrong with them?
Not at all. I come back to what I said earlier, which is that people should be entitled to live their lives as they want. But as a mental health professional, I have to have the best interests of the clients that are in front of me. And I have to have the best interests of children as well. So not at all am I transphobic. And actually, one of the most shocking things since I entered into this space was the amount of detransitioners that I've encountered who, went all the way down these pathways and have ended up seriously regretting it, some of whom have had irreversible surgery, which can never be rectified. So I think transphobia is a very easy slur that gets thrown about a lot, but actually all it does is take away from the open, honest dialogue that we should be having about what is a very serious issue.
James Esses, thank you very much for joining us. James Esses is a trainee psychotherapist and counsellor. A fascinating story. Now, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, have got in touch with GB News in the last few minutes, and they have issued the following statement. We respect people's rights to hold different views, but volunteers can't give the impression that Childline endorses their personal campaigns. It's vital that children know that Childline is a welcoming place for all young people. The charity goes on, we believe this is a reasonable expectation. We've discussed the situation at length with the volunteer and have told him the door is open for him to return to volunteering if we can get assurances. Wow.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.